is Ethics. My name is Mark Thorsby. And in this course, we're taking a look at how classic concepts in ethics can relate to the everyday in terms of our thinking and interacting. If you'd like to join us, please follow along with the readings. We're using Ethics Essential Readings in Moral Philosophy, which is edited by George Scher. But pretty much all the texts are available online for free. So take a look. Follow along with this, that is. So now, before we get into today's discussion, what we've been doing over these past couple weeks, or at least over the past couple of videos, is we've been looking at how there's been different sort of specific moral theories, and we've looked in pretty great depth with regard to some of them. But today we're going to sort of step back and sort of ask ourselves, well, wait a second, don't we also need to consider the fact that maybe there is no general universal standard for how we ought to act in the world? Maybe the moral standards we have are simply conventions. Perhaps they're just cultural customs. And this leads us to the question today of cultural relativism. And I think it's important for us to address the topic. So despite the fact that we've seen with utilitarianism, the idea that we can maximize happiness, if we maximize happiness of all, then that is what we can use to guide us in terms of what's wrong and right in our lives, versus the idea of, for instance, following one's moral duty as it's rationally available to us. And then here we can think about deontology, our moral duties. So we've been looking at these sort of conceptions. All of these thinkers up to this point have really think that moral actions can be determined wrong or right. So the theories we've been looking at are confident that there's at least potential answers for us with regard to these moral questions. But cultural relativism actually, I think, is the norm. And what I mean by that is most students I meet, most people I meet, and in most conversations I meet, and granted, I live in the United States, so maybe it certainly is different in other places. But most people I meet, when you begin to ask them in terms of why one moral belief is wrong versus another moral belief, what you typically find is at some point, people will just say, well, that's just what they do. That's just how they act, and that's how they believe, and there's nothing else to it. And then ultimately, based on that, we should be tolerant of all beliefs. And so you have a sort of cultural relativism that I think is quite pervasive. And so what we want to do today is begin to think about it in a little bit more depth. And we'll see today that the thinker we're looking at here, his name is James Rachels. And he has an essay called The Challenge of Cultural Relativism. And what we're going to be looking at is taking stock of the key points within that essay. And so it begins sort of this question, Rachel's, it begins with the question really of how different cultures have different moral codes, or why is the fact that, given the fact that different cultures do have different moral beliefs and customs, it raises the question, well, is there a universal standard? Are we able to make judgments? He actually begins quite nicely in this essay by retelling the story that's given to us by Herodotus. If you're not familiar with who Herodotus is an ancient Greek historian. Much of what we know about the ancient Greek world comes from Herodotus. So it's really quite readable, in fact. So I encourage you to go online. You can read some Herodotus. You can read his account of this example. That brings out the question of cultural relativism and also, I think, moral pluralism. And he gives the example of King Darius. Now, King Darius was a very, very famous king of the Persian Empire, who the Greeks did not have a good time with. But King Darius, one of the things he was interested in is the different moral customs that people had, and asking the question of whether or not one custom is wrong versus another custom being right. And you can also think back from the perspective of King Darius here. He has a kingdom that has many, many different cultures contained within it. And from his perspective, one of those cultures is Greek. Now, the Greeks didn't quite agree with that. But anyway, so he became sort of attuned, or he remarks on this difference in moral custom with regard particularly to the case of how we bury our dead, or how we dispose with our dead in the ceremonies. As you probably know, one of the most ancient customs in all of human history is burial. In fact, anthropologists note that there are burial customs that extend very, very far back, definitely further back than the written record. So this is one of the most ancient things that human beings do, is that when their kin die, they bury them, or they usually have a ritualistic practice by which they dispose of the bodies. Um, in the United States today, I think generally most people, I believe, are cremated. Though I don't have the facts on hand, and they probably are changing. But what we see is largely cremation and burial is the primary means by which we dispose of the dead today. Now, in the ancient Greek world, at the time of King Darius, the Greeks that he had spoken to, right, and he remarks about, their primary practice was cremation, usually through a funeral pyre. This has often been depicted in films and this sort of thing. So this is how the Greeks disposed of the dead, through cremation, ritualistic funeral pyres. Whereas by contrast, he gives this example of the collations. Now this picture is not, of course, this is a real picture of a funeral pyre. But this here picture is of a tribe that practices a form of ritual cannibalism of the dead. And this is what King Darius remarks on. In his day, the collations were a group of people, a society, in which the way in which they're dead, they would ritualistically eat their fathers' bodies. Today, the example here is this was done usually, they think, through making of a soup, and then everyone in the community partakes in that soup. Now, what King Darius did is he asked the Greeks, would they ever eat their fathers' bodies when they died? And they were horrified by the idea, so the Greeks were absolutely opposed to that. And then he asked the Colossians, would you burn your fathers when they died? And they were also absolutely horrified by that and asked not to talk about it with them again. And King Darius sort of delighted in this and recognized that it doesn't look like there's any one way this should be. It's just that the Greeks do it one way and the Colossians do it another. And so this raises, for instance, the question of cultural and moral difference. Now, here's a contemporary example that Rachel discusses, and he talks about the Eskimos. And the Eskimos are a small group of people, a small culture of indigenous people to the region of far northwestern North America, Alaska and Canada principally, as well as islands. So there's the Eskimos, and he gives the example of the initial anthropological descriptions of the Eskimo people in terms of the differing moral practices that they exhibited. Now, I should say today, and frankly, I don't know. I'm not an anthropologist, so you may want to look in the anthropology of this, do some research. But my wife, for instance, is from Alaska, and so I don't believe that. I'm not certain how much of these moral practices apply to, for instance, the urban native population, for instance, in Anchorage. I don't know. It's an interesting question. Maybe if there's someone who's Eskimo watching, they can tell us. But in the example here, it looks like there's very, very different moral practices. On the one hand, it looks like there was forms of polygamy practiced. And there's for instance, not only was there polygamy, but it looked like there was a very, very different sexual relationships than we're typically accustomed to thinking about in our own society. That is sort of Occidental Western tradition. So there's polygamy, but not just that. For instance, husbands would allow regular sexual access to their wives to other men. Women, of course, were allowed to break these arrangements, but by leaving their original husband. And this, of course, Rachel suggests could create lots of problems because sometimes men would want their wives to leave. But you have a very, very different sort of structure. Another more key, and I think probably shocking for most people, practice was the infanticide of both the elderly and children. So infanticide here is the practice of killing a child after it's been born. Now, infanticide in this case would have been practiced principally by leaving the infant in the cold and the snow. In fact, elderly people, when they became too old and too sick, would be left out in the snow. You might think of this as a form of euthanasia, or maybe it's not technically euthanasia as such, but it raises an interesting sort of question. Now, one of the things, though, of course, infanticide is in the United States is completely illegal, and in most cases, elderly that would be considered murder or illegal as well. So those are two starkly different practices. Now I put girls on there because Rachel's remarks in a sort of important point, and one which I think would most people find highly morally objectionable, is the fact that most of the infants that would be euthanized, as it were girls. And so it looks like there's a heavy prejudice towards the infanticide of girls rather than boys, which looks on the face of it to be highly morally problematic. So the question is, how can we make sense of this? So the first sort of option that looks plausible, at least initially, is the notion to just say, well, listen, they are a completely different culture. The Eskimos were, just like the Galatians were, a completely different culture from the Greeks. And so long as those cultures were separate, they seem to exist fine, and the societies continue to exist. So who are we to judge, as it were? Maybe the answer here is that our moral values are ultimately relative to the culture in which we inhabit. And that's the basis and the origin of the differences of our different moral practices and different moral beliefs. And given that, that means, as it were, do in Rome as the Romans do. In other words, when one moves into a different culture, that means that they're moving into a different moral framework. And so there's a whole range of sort of possible complications with this. But we'll also see that cultural relativism, I think, has significant problems with it. Now, let's sort of get clear a little bit. Now, what Rachel's does here is, I love it. He quotes a 1906 sociologist, W.G. Summers, and who talks about the way in which it looks like moral values are merely just cultural products. So he says, quote, the right way is the way which the ancestors used and which has been handed down. The tradition is its own warrant. It's not held subject to verification by experience. The notion of right is in the folk ways. It's not outside of them, of independent origin, and brought to test them. In the folk ways, whatever is right. This is because they are traditional and therefore contain in themselves the authority of the ancestral ghost. When we come to the folk ways, we are at the end of our analysis. So this is sort of an interesting description of what looks to be the notion of moral values in these practices are merely just cultural at the bottom. And when we get to the answer here, it's just our cultural history and our traditions, and that's just where they are. That's where they're from, and that's their basis, period. End of sentence. Now, this means that every moral standard would be culture bound. That should say is, not if. Apology there. Every standard is culture bound. And this also raises a deep problem in ethics, which I put here, skepticism in ethics, or namely the idea here is, it raises the question whether or not ethics really can actually determine what's right and wrong. In other words, think of it this way. If cultural relativism is true, then we can explain the differences in moral theory as well. Right? You have one moral theory, for instance, you have utilitarianism, you have deontology, you have ancient Greek virtue ethics, right? So you have these different moral theories. And if cultural relativism is true, that would mean that the philosophies themselves, the reasons given for these things, are ultimately just expressions of cultural traditions and customs and norms. And this raises a lot of questions about whether or not ethics can even deliver on the question of how we ought to act. And I think ultimately this skepticism probably can lead into a form of moral nihilism, in which one simply denies that there are any moral values, they can deny that there are any moral standards. This raises a red flag for most philosophers here in this case. Namely, and the red flag is this, which is, if that's the case, then how can we make moral judgments? So for instance, how can I be sure that the Holocaust was wrong? For instance, actually just a week ago, I took my son and my daughter to the Holocaust Museum. Um, and the question there is, or not the question, the reason I took them is because I want them to learn that these forms of action are wrong. That it's wrong to round up people because of their religion or race or category or however you want to define it. And then to systematically kill them and destroy them. I think that's wrong. Personally, I think that's wrong always and under all conditions. That is, genocide is always wrong. But you can see here, is it if cultural relativism is the case? Because if cultural relativism is the case, then one could simply say, well, from the Nazis' perspective, their cultural standard was that what they were doing was justified, right? So this raises the question of, to what extent can ethics actually be of practical importance? We talked with Peter Singer about the difference between practical ethics and meta-ethics. And you can see here, if the goal ultimately is to act, like Peter Singer suggests, practically, then if ethics can't even tell me ultimately how I ought to act, it really is just an expression of the culture I'm in, then it looks like knowledge is not even possible in ethics. And it looks like I'm just going to act, well, how I've been raised to act. Right? I'll just be a traditionalist, if you will. So this raises a really important problem. And there's a number of different philosophers who discuss this. If you want to continue your research on the question, take a look at Bernard Williams, who discusses this in depth. I even have a video lecture on him somewhere posted. So take a look at that. Bernard Williams is important. Or we actually read Bernard Williams here. But take a look at his book, The Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy. Also, this is great. You need to also take a look at Friedrich Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality, which ultimately does argue that he's not really a cultural relativist per se, but you'll see that cultural relativism would be consistent with his views regarding morality, which ultimately leads to a form of nihilism. So take a look at that. So let's break down the argument. What exactly is the cultural relativist argument? And here's where he breaks it down into really 6 different propositions. Let's take a look at them. Number 1, different societies have different moral codes, right? And that appears to be true. Number 2, there is no objective standard that can be used to judge one societal code that's better than another. 3, the moral code of our own society has no special status. It is merely one among many. And number 4, there is no universal truth in ethics. That is, there are no moral truths that hold for all peoples at all times. 5, the moral code of a society determines what is right within that society. That is, if the moral code of a society says that a certain action is right, then that action is right, at least within the society. And number 6, it's mere arrogance for us to try to judge the conduct of other peoples. We should adopt an attitude of tolerance towards the practices of other cultures. I think sometimes this is related to another argument, or this really in a certain way is an argument. This is really the 6 propositions that the cultural relativist seems to be holding, it's also the consequence of some of the propositions that the cultural relativist holds. Now what we need to do though is we need to determine how this argument actually functions and how these propositions are, because it looks like the basic argument is there's cultural difference, therefore there's no cultural standard, and therefore we can't make moral judgments about what those standards are or should be for all people at all times. This means that if cultural relativism is the case, then we would have to deny that there really are universal human rights. So for instance, do some research while you're online, pause the video, go to the United Nations and take a look at the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. There's a whole list of rights that it looks like that the United Nations does affirm as being the case, as ones which should hold for all people at all times. Think about that here. The right not to be killed unjustifiably, right? That's not one of the rights the way it's described on the UN, but that's something that I think a human rights person would agree with, is that no one everyone should have the right and therefore the protection not to be killed without some sort of justifiable reason. For instance, in a time of war, someone can be killed if there is capital punishment in a society, and so on and so forth. So it raises this question of, can we have universal truth? And this seems to deny it. Notice here that this is a really big problem ultimately, because ultimately this would suggest that certain horrific things in history, things like the Holocaust, things such as genocide. Take a look at the Timorese, the genocide that occurred in East Timor, for instance. These things, I think, violate universal moral obligations. But if cultural relativism is the case, then theoretically, I'm not justified in arguing that what they're doing is that I'm arguing that genocide is morally wrong or right. Right? It merely is just a cultural product, as it were. To me, that seems very dangerous and disturbing. And so, how can we explain this? And we have to take a look at the argument. Now, Rachel's calls this the cultural differences argument. And he's going to break down the argument for us. Now, when we take a look at an argument, you should always remember that an argument has really two major things within it. An argument has both its form and its content. Okay. Now, remember, an argument is when you're trying to when you provide evidence for a specific sort of conclusion. So the evidence, right? It depends on the structure of it depends on how you structure the evidence in your argument form in order for the argument to make sense, to be logical. But every argument also depends upon the content. So, for instance, let me give you an example. This is the famous example that comes from Aristotle. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Okay, that argument has a form, and the form is something like all all MRT. Socrates is a M. Therefore, Socrates is a T. In other words, there's a fundamental structure that underlies the ideas that the argument is about. Whether or not there really was a person named Socrates, whether or not human beings really are mortal, that's about the content of the argument. Whereas the presentation of the argument has a certain structure or form. And we're going to see Rachel's break down what he sees to be an invalid structure. Now, if an argument's form is logical, we call it valid. If it's illogical, we say it's invalid. What does that mean? A valid argument is one in which, if the premises of an argument are true, that is, if the evidence given for the argument is true, it necessarily follows that the conclusion has to be true. This is what we call a valid argument. That is, that you can actually infer the conclusion from the premises. You could actually deduce from the evidence that's given in an argument that the conclusion's true. Now, whether or not it's true in reality is what we determine when we talk about in terms of an argument being sound or unsound. Rachel says that the cultural difference argument is an unsound argument. Any argument that whose form is invalid, that is, any argument where the premises can be true but the conclusion still can be false, is what we call an invalid argument. And an invalid argument is obviously unsound. So, now, if you want to learn more about this, you need to take logic or take an introduction to logic. Take a look at my video lectures on the introduction of logic where I lay this stuff out. But it's helpful to know this. So what Rachel's going to suggest ultimately is that the cultural difference argument is actually just illogical, right? Here's the basic argument. To take a look, when we looked at the Greeks, what we said is that the Greeks believed it was wrong to eat the dead, whereas the Galatians believed it was right to eat the dead. Therefore, eating the dead is neither objectively wrong or right. It's merely a matter of opinion, which varies from culture to culture. And then take a look at the Eskimo case. Whoops, this says Galatians. I think I mistook that. That should say Eskimos, because, oops. Okay, so let's go like this. Take a look at the Eskimo case. The Eskimos see nothing is wrong with infanticide, whereas Americans believe infanticide is immoral. Therefore, infanticide is neither objectively wrong or right. It's merely a matter of opinion, which varies from culture to culture. So it looks like the basic structure of the argument in both cases, no matter what culture or what moral thing we're talking about, is that different cultures have different moral codes. Therefore, there is no objective truth in morality. Right and wrong are only matters of opinion, and opinions simply vary. They're simply just different for one reason or another. So that looks like the basic form of the argument, but look what the structure of the argument is doing. You starting off with the fact of disagreement, the fact that there are different moral practices, and then you're making a judgment regarding the status of moral objectivity itself. And so the question is, does that actually follow? Can you point out something that is the case, the idea that two people disagree about something, and then conclude from there that their disagreement means there really isn't a right or wrong answer regarding what they're talking about? Well, no, that doesn't follow. And it doesn't follow because there's lots of cases in which just because people disagree does not mean that you can't make a judgment about something. For instance, imagine if you're teaching a child how to do long division, and let's say the child does the answer incorrectly, and when the child's asking you, you're helping them, why the answer is 26, let's say, and the real answer is 29. I'm making this up. And you can have a disagreement. The child could disagree with me on whether or not their answer is wrong or right. But simply because the child and myself are in disagreement, the fact of disagreement doesn't mean that there is no right answer to the long division problem. Right? So the fact of disagreement or difference does not in itself entail the conclusion that there is no objective moral standard. So for instance, let's consider an example. There are some societies, historically and potentially even now, some people, some cultures believe the world's flat. And they disagree with our view that the world is round. Does it follow that an objective determination cannot be made? No. The world is round, and the fact is those people in that society are wrong. The world is wrong. I'm sorry, not wrong. The world is round. It's not flat. And this has been proven. And so it would be irrational to then argue that simply because there are societies who disagree with us, that there is no answers possible. Now, we should be clear here that there does seem to be a difference with regard to morality and moral thoughts, moral ideas versus ideas about the physical world. Now, I think there is something different, and at the end of the video here, we're going to take a look at a quick essay, a very short little excerpt, that looks at the question of what it means to have a moral observation. So we're going to talk about that in a minute, sort of highlight that. But no, that doesn't seem to make sense. That doesn't follow. So Rachel says, quote, "The fundamental mistake in the cultural differences argument is that it attempts to derive a substantive conclusion about a subject from the mere fact that people disagree with it." Right? But one thing, so the cultural difference argument fails. And you'll actually, if you begin to talk to different people about what they think morally, you'll see that the cultural differences argument is what tends to underlie people's conception of cultural tolerance. There's a lot of emphasis placed in American culture, and especially, for instance, in the Western Academy, on the importance of promoting difference and the importance of promoting diversity. And sometimes one of the arguments that's made in promotion of diversity is the notion that we should always engender cultural tolerance. And usually when you ask people about cultural tolerance, what underlies it is this cultural differences argument. And that's a bad argument. And so we should reject it. I don't think that means we should reject the promotion and the celebration of diversity, but I think it means I think it means we should be weary potentially of the different arguments that come along with the language of cultural tolerance. I'm not a fan of it, frankly. But guess what? Just because the argument fails doesn't mean that cultural relativism is necessarily false. So Rachel's is a good philosopher here, and he says, listen, just because this argument fails, and just because there's these problems that we don't like regarding the cultural differences argument, right? The challenge that we can't make moral judgments. Just because those things are the case doesn't necessitate that it's actually false. Maybe the anthropologists are right. So what we need to do is we need to consider what it means to take cultural relativism seriously and ask, what would be the case if it really were true? Now, social standards, that would mean that social standards alone would form the basis and origin of our moral codes, practices, and traditions. I thought it important to distinguish these three. And my thinking, Rachel's doesn't offer a worked out conception in this essay of what these things refer to, but I would say that a moral code refers to um, the basic list of values that people hold, the type of practices they do that uphold those moral codes, and the sorts of traditions that get developed within a culture. All of those seem to create, for the cultural relativists, really, if you will, the atmosphere of the moral framework. Now, if that's the case, and that ultimately all of it's based upon social standards, there's three big consequences. One, we can no longer say that the moral customs of other societies are morally inferior to our own. And I would add here, this would also mean you can no longer say that the moral customs of other societies are morally superior to our own. Right? It would mean that they're just simply different. Number two, we would decide whether actions are right or wrong just by consulting the standards of our own society. Sorry, there's a little typo there. By the way, part of the reason I have these typos is a lot of people ask me what software I use. I use Prezi, and Prezi doesn't seem to have any spell checker, and it's very difficult to catch these, so I apologize. Um, so, we would, number two is we decide whether actions are right or wrong just by consulting the standards of our society. So, for instance, you could ask yourself, is it wrong for me to evade taxes, right? Well, on the one hand, I could say, well, yes, it's wrong to get caught evading taxes, but it looks like most the standards of our society, as given by the fact that lots and lots of people actually, in fact, do tax evasion. I'm thinking of people who put money in the Cayman Islands and things like this. It raises the question: people, if this is what people are doing, then that means it's one of the standards. Tax evasion, I guess, technically does break the standards of our society. But you can think of cases where, let me think of a different case. Um, Imagine, oh, well, I mean, for instance, imagine if I have a choice and I can choose to do one thing or another. The cultural relativists will say, okay, well, in order to determine how you should act, you should just ask, well, what do most people do or what do most people believe? What's the social general view? And then from there, just do that thing. So, for instance, that would mean that in the 1950s, the social standard in the South of the United States was to segregate the races. So we had racial segregation. And so imagine if I'm an owner and I'm opening up a shop and I'm allowed to choose whether or not I will have a racially segregated um, restaurant or something. They'll just say, well, the standard is that you should racially segregate, therefore racial segregation is right. Right? So if I have to decide whether or not my actions are wrong or right, I just consult the standards. That's a clearer case for how it's problematic than the tax evasion case. So sorry about that. And by the way, that's not Rachel's, that's me. The third consequence is that the idea of moral progress itself gets called into doubt. So what we see here is the three big consequences are that there is no moral custom that is wrong or right when compared with each other. Number two, the determination of whether an action is wrong or right would ultimately just have to come from whatever standards in place. And number three, their moral progress doesn't really seem to make sense anymore. And think about here the fact that we've moved in the Western world and most of the world entirely away from the practice of slavery. So today, most places on the earth, slavery is against the law. That doesn't mean it's not practiced, but it's against the law. That signifies great moral progress. That doesn't seem to be really something that makes sense anymore under the cultural relativist framework. So, what are some of the consequences here? Well, obviously, the possibility of making moral judgments is being undermined. So that means that my ability to affirm or deny that one practice is wrong or right no longer becomes a credible alternative for me, which creates problems because most of the time I talk about making moral judgments about other people and other cultures, but cultural relativism seems to undermine, at least I would argue, it seems to undermine my ability to make my own moral judgments about myself and about whether or not what I'm doing is ultimately wrong or what's right. And ultimately, relativism, I think, actually destroys our ability to make moral judgments entirely. Because what happens is, where does the difference lie, right? And what is the exact difference between a culture? It's clear that a culture is an amorphous thing. A culture is not an object in the world, right? So cultures sort of bleed into each other. So what exactly, and you can even go into more depth, within cultures, there's communities who also have different moral practices and traditions. And then within those communities, there's even further differences between moral prescriptions. So for the cultural relativist, there's this basic problem of, well, there's difference both at the macro and the micro level. Those differences become increasingly localized. And that would raise the question of, okay, well, then what exactly is my moral standard? So can I make a moral judgment about my own actions? And I'm not sure you can do that. Rachel's doesn't go through that, but I think that's an important consideration for us to consider. Number two here, the second point, cultural relativism precludes us from saying that certain practices, such as anti-Semitism, discrimination are wrong, anti-Semitic discrimination are wrong, such as slavery. I mean, we can think of a whole host of practices that people have committed that we would be against. I don't care who you are, what culture you're in. There's a whole range of things, but it would mean that specifically here, anti-Semitic discrimination, we couldn't say it was wrong. We would just have to say that it is. Now, that would mean that, keep going here, is there's no difference then between the values we should hold from the values we do hold, right? I think what you see here is you see a collapse between the prescriptive and the descriptive. Or in other words, I think they just merge into pure description, such that, because you can ask yourself, for instance, the thief holds stealing in high value, right? Whereas the policeman holds the law in high value. But you can say here, it looks like one should hold the law in value and not hold stealing as a value. But you can see here is that if there were enough people, right, who did hold it in value, well, there's no difference then between what we should hold from what we do hold in terms of our moral values and practices. Okay, so social practices then, like racial segregation and apartheid, would be morally correct in the societies that would practice them. M here is, I should say morally, not orally. So that would mean, for instance, apartheid in South Africa was justified so long as it existed, right? It would mean that racial segregation in the United States was morally correct so long as it was the case. It would mean that the rounding up of the Jews in the 1930s and 40s was morally correct while it was happening to in those societies for those societies, right? So that means we can't criticize the moral customs of our own society either, and the moral progress and social reform themselves get called into question. Take, for example, the case of women's rights and women's suffrage, right? And think, in the United States at least, women have only had the right to vote within the past 100 years, almost or barely, depending upon when you're watching this. So women's rights and the progress of allowing women not to be discriminated against, right? This is no longer something that's credible morally, right? That would mean that moral progress is just reduced to change, right? So what the cultural relativist has to be committed to saying then, and this is taking it seriously, would be that it's not the case that women should have the right to vote or that women should not have the right to vote. It's not that one or the other is wrong or right. It's just the fact that it's just different now, right? So that means that when we go back in time and we look at the arguments that were made against women's rights, we'd have to recognize that they're really at the same level as the arguments that we have in favor of women's rights. So this creates a lot of problems here. Cultural relativism really just seems implausible on its face, is Rachel's ultimate conclusion. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that, because he has a wider discussion of cultural relativism that continues. But he says, to many thinkers, cultural relativism seems just implausible. It does make sense, they say, to condemn some practices such as slavery and anti-Semitism wherever they occur. But the question is why? Why exactly is cultural relativism wrong here? And why should we argue that some practices should never be practiced? Right? Why is the Holocaust wrong regardless of the culture or the moral differences? The cultural differences. So, for instance, he gives the example, of course, he's thinking of India. He says, consider a society that believes it's wrong to eat cows. Now, if you're I don't know who you are or what your views are, but most people don't have a problem with eating cows. And in fact, many, many people every day eat many, many cows. And there's a question about whether or not that's wrong or right, but we're not going to look at that here. But what we can say is that, okay, this represents a cultural moral difference between that society and our own. Given that, on the face of it, the cultural relativists would say, okay, that means that since there's a difference belief here, then there can be no answer. And that means that there can be no objective moral standard. But wait a second, Rachel says. The key here is to consider the type of explanation that can be given for why there's a difference in the belief. And the answer here is, for instance, so if you ask someone and their answer was reincarnation, that is, they believe that when human beings die, human souls are reincarnated into the bodies of other animals, and notably and in particular into cows. That would mean that from this culture's perspective, because they have the belief of reincarnation here into cows, therefore they don't want to eat the cows because they consider that a form of cannibalism. That is, they're eating their own family member potentially. Right? And no one wants, like, we also agree here that it's wrong to eat our own family members, right? So what you can see here is that even though there's a difference in moral practice, the explanation reveals that it's a difference in belief, not a difference in value. That we both value life, and we both, but the difference here is because if we believe seriously that if I believe seriously that the soul of my mother was incarnated into the soul of a pig, I wouldn't eat that pig. Right? That's because I value what happens to my mother, and they value whoever is in this society. They would value that same value. So we can ask the question: what's the origin of these social customs? And the answer is there's probably many factors that work together to produce the customs of the society. There's probably many, many reasons. So he doesn't offer us an exhaustive argument for what the origin of social custom is, but he does suggest that some of the origin of social customs can be linked to the essential necessary conditions for that society to exist. Right? He says cultural differences in moral belief may be largely attributed to different social histories and the different beliefs about the world that get created out of those histories. And the key here, I think, is Rachel doesn't say this per se. He actually doesn't talk about history. But I think there's sort of two things you can look at here. One is you can look at the history, and you have to also look at the geography, I think, of a culture. And when you look at the history and the geography, you're able to map out the essential conditions that would be required for those people to live in that society. And it's interesting here to think about the Eskimos here lived in, they had a history of practices and beliefs about the world. They had certain religious beliefs and so forth. But they also had a geography. They lived in a context that was very difficult to exist in. And over time, the cultural history and the cultural beliefs mix, I think, in relationship to that geography and to the situation. And this seems to be where these social customs might arise, or some of them at least. So once the circumstances for belief get explained, it looks like we generally do find these common moral principles, right? So go back to the Eskimos. One of the things that's particularly morally problematic, at least on the face of it, prima facie, is the fact that infanticide is practiced, and that in particular, more girls girl babies and infants are killed than boy babies. So it looks like sexual discrimination of the absolute worst kind. But one of the things that the anthropologists discovered is that there's a very, very high, there was a very, very high mortality rate for the men who lived in the Eskimo communities, these very rural and very extreme locations. And that because the men were primarily played the role of hunting and obtaining food for the society, but because the conditions were so harsh, many men died. Consequently, women would live much longer than men. So over time, what would happen is if left unchecked, there'd be more and more women, less and less men, and then there wouldn't be enough men to get food needed for all of the community. So the anthropologists actually observed, quote, were it not for female infanticide, there would be approximately 1.5 times as many females in the average Eskimo local group as there are food-producing males. In other words, the entire community starves to death. So the answer here is in the explanation. The reason here would be that girls are particularly prone towards infanticide versus boys would be the answer that if it wasn't that way, the entire community itself couldn't exist. In other words, drastic measures in a drastic environment ensure survival. And to be clear here, the Eskimos, and we don't want to give, and Rachel doesn't want to give the Eskimos a bad name here, the practice of infanticide was only practiced under the most extreme conditions, right? All conditions would be met not to practice this. And for instance, children in the Eskimo communities are highly prized and valued. So we have to be clear here that it's not, the explanation isn't that the Eskimo people don't value their children. It's just that in order to survive, in some cases, it was required. And so it looks like there might be a common moral principle. Now, all cultures, therefore, must have some values that are in common, because some values might be necessary conditions for any society or group they're necessary for those groups to follow in order to maintain their existence. So if we consider the infanticide issue again, what we get here is that, one, human infants are helpless and cannot survive if they're not given extensive care for a period of years. Therefore, if a group didn't care for its young, the young would not survive, and the older members of the group would not be replaced, and after a while, the group would die out. Therefore, any cultural group that continues to exist must care for its young. Infants that are not cared for must be an exception rather than the rule, right? And he gives another example of truth-telling. Imagine a society that didn't have a value placed on telling the truth. Now, what Rachel says here is that by and large, the value has to be what is valued most of the time. So there's always going to be exceptions. So some conditions will arise in which it's okay not to tell the truth. But the general rule has to be truth-telling, because if it weren't, if the general rule of a society were that you should lie, then there'd be no point to communication. And the whole point of communicating with people is to elicit knowledge or ideas from other people and to communicate those ideas in a way which maintains fidelity. But that wouldn't be possible. Think about our discussion of Immanuel Kant here in the categorical imperative. Another example here would be prohibitions against murder. Right? If you had a society that didn't, by and large, have prohibitions against murder, then the society would itself break down. So there do seem to be certain necessary universal conditions. And there are some moral rules that all societies will have in common, because those rules are necessary for that society to exist. Not every moral rule can vary from society to society. Now, this means that cultural relativism, at least in the extreme, seems implausible. What are the lessons here? Well, number one, cultural relativism warns us, Rachel suggests, quite rightly, about the danger of assuming that all of our preferences are based on some absolute moral standard. And number two, the second lesson has to do with the idea that we ought to keep an open mind. So his notion here is the cultural relativist differences argument fails. Cultural relativism still could be the case, but not in the most extreme sense. So because there are certain necessary conditions that have to underlie the values of that society. So the lesson here is that on the one hand, we have to take seriously the idea that there may be some practices that we have that don't really have an absolute moral standard. But there may be others in which we can, that there is a potential moral standard. And then finally, that the second lesson has to do that we should be humble and we should keep an open mind and not necessarily jump to the judgment of another culture or judging another cultural practice, because there may be a common value between the two. So we can come to understand that our feelings are not necessarily perceptions of the truth. A lot of times we have moral feelings, and those moral feelings, we take it that those moral feelings are true simply by virtue of the fact that we hold them and we experience them. And so he didn't. And so this isn't always the case. And this is the lesson of cultural relativism. Now, what I want to do here next is I'm going to go through this even quickly, and it's a very short little excerpt by Gilbert Harman, who talks about ethics and observation. Because a question gets raised here. We've talked about cultural relativism, and by and large, some of the major reasons we should reject it. But then we can ask, well, can moral principles be tested and confirmed in the way that scientific principles can? And I thought this is an interesting sort of thing to throw in here, right? Because we're asking the question, when we talk about cultural relativism, that means we're also talking about our experience we have in which we recognize their actions as being wrong or right. So the question is, what is happening when we observe and when we compare cultures and observe their different moral behaviors? And the other question here is, if there are moral principles that could be objective, like these necessary condition things, then can we confirm them scientifically? Or can we confirm them in a way that's like the scientific forms of observation? And keep in mind here that when a scientific observation is done, we're talking about it as an experimental observation and then trying to falsify a hypothesis regarding how that experiment is going to do or act or result in some way. So for instance, think about any sort of scientific experiment possible. Then what happens is you have a sort of a series of assumptions. You have a hypothesis of what you think will happen under certain conditions. And then you create a test in which you create those conditions to see if your assumptions and hypotheses hold true. And if they don't, that is, you can falsify it, then you know your hypothesis is wrong. And if you can't do that, then you haven't been able to falsify your hypothesis, which leads to the increased likelihood that it's a good idea. So this is how scientists, physical and material scientists, and even social scientists to a certain degree, well, I would say social scientists as well, try to falsify these hypotheses. So some examples seem to confirm the possibility, right? And some examples seem to confirm the possibility of what looks like an observation that confirms or denies a moral principle. He gives, imagine an example of 6 patients go into a hospital. 5 patients have extensive injuries, and 1 person is extremely injured, but there's only 1 doctor on staff. So in this case, the doctor, right, can spend all of his time to save that 1 patient, but the other 5 will die. Or he can save the other 5, but that 1 patient will die. Should he save 5 or the 1? And you can ask yourself, what do you think you should do? Most people will say you should save the 5, right? So this looks like a case where you can observe an event and then say the principle applies here. This event seems to infer that you have a moral principle to save more people than less, right? Well, wait a second. Let's give another case. In this case, we have 6 patients too who have 5 extensive injuries, but we have another healthy patient who's just in the other room. And these extensive injuries are such that unless there's immediate organ transplantations, all these patients will die. 1 patient needs lungs, another patient needs a heart, another patient needs a liver, so on and so forth. So should you just go find the guy who's next door who is just in for a regular checkup and kill him to save the other 5? Right? Most people would say, no, that seems wrong. Right? In that case, it looks like you can't it's not a numbers game, right? So you can see here, there's interesting cases here in which we can observe these events, and then it looks like we can derive immediate inferences about what should happen. So it looks like observation might have some sort of relationship here to how we assess these moral principles. But here's the thing, all of that is just a thought experiment. That's all imaginary, number one. But when I say it's a thought experiment, what is a thought experiment? It's a method that philosophers frequently use. What it is we draw out our moral intuitions and our perceptions by giving imaginary examples. So for instance, another example, imagine you're on a plane and it crashes in the Himalayas. There's only 3 people that survive. You, the pilot, and a small boy who's broken his leg and can't be moved. And it's clear that you're going to have to hike out of the Himalayas. The boy's not going to make it either way. So the pilot suggests let's actually kill him, cannibalize him so we'll have enough food, because otherwise we're going to starve to death because we're so far remotely removed. Should you kill the boy and cannibalize him? Right? Now, most people will probably say no to that. I don't know what you would say to that. But you can see that's an imaginary example that's trying to draw out how you see and perceive the moral problem. But you can see here, this is not the same thing as an experimental observation in a number of different ways. Because in an experimental observation, you're able to falsify the hypothesis. In the case of the thought experiment, you're not falsifying anything. You're merely revealing your moral reaction, your intuition, and perhaps your dispositions. So there is a difference here in that case. So, but let's talk a little bit about observation in more detail. Number one, all of our observations are actually theory-laden. Why is that? Why is it that he suggests this? Well, when you perceive something, when you observe something, you have to perceive it. But your perception requires knowledge of what you're seeing, right? So imagine would you hire someone to observe, let's say here, imagine there's a nuclear reactor and you want to observe it to make sure it's working. Would you hire a person to do that who's never seen a nuclear reactor and knows nothing about nuclear reaction at all? No, because they would be unable to know what they're looking at. So you can see here is that you first, in order to perceive things and to understand them, you have to have knowledge of what you're perceiving. But your knowledge is dependent upon really a context of different beliefs that hold together. In the case of the scientific case, there's a whole worked out physicalist theories that play that role. In the case of morality, you have to ask, well, there's maybe a background set of beliefs that are contextualizing how you understand what's happening. And this means that all of the observations have this theory-laden, have a theory-laden quality to them. So, if, quote, this is from 161 in the text, if we say that observation has occurred whenever an opinion is a direct result of perception, we must allow that there's a moral observation, it would seem, right? So, but does moral observation confirm or disconfirm a moral principle? I think it's interesting here because he argues that it's possible to observe moral activity, but he's ultimately argued that we can't ultimately derive from those observations that a particular moral principle is wrong or right. In other words, just because we perceive something as being wrong doesn't necessarily mean that it really is wrong. It's going to be the ultimate conclusion here. So let's start here by comparing science and morality and thinking about the difference in terms of observational evidence. Let's start with science. So in the case of science, one starts with assumptions about certain physical facts that support or are supported by a particular theory. And then from there, one devises an experiment to falsify a particular possibility, a hypothesis. And this thereby allows the observation to play a role in either confirming or disconfirming the hypothesis, right? So you say, this molecule should act in such and such way if this is right. So I'm going to put it in these conditions and see if it acts like that. Guess what? It didn't act like that, so I've now disconfirmed my hypothesis. I know that I was wrong. That's the basic scientific method. It's a lot more complicated in reality, though. But guess what? That's not the same as what happens as the role of observation in morality, right? He says, and I'm going to quote here, a moral observation does not seem in the same sense to be observational evidence for or against a moral theory, since the truth or falsity of the moral observation seems to be completely irrelevant to any reasonable explanation of why that observation was made. Right? Because in the case of the physical, you can say the reason this observation occurred is because the feature of the world was such that it conformed to my hypothetical proposition. But in the moral case, you see the observation is not related in the same way. So the fact that you made a particular moral observation when you did does not seem to be evidence about moral facts. It's only evidence about you and your moral sensibility. So the key difference here is in the case of science, one is observing the world as a part of a methodology for confirming or disconfirming something. In the case of morality, when you make a moral observation, you're really making an observation about yourself, actually. You're observing your behavior to, or your reaction to a specific perception that you've had. But that observation, yeah, it does tell you what your moral views are, but it doesn't tell you that the moral principles you think are related really are. And so that means the moral principles do not seem to help explain your observing what you observe. In other words, the moral principles have nothing to do with what's happening. Now, the next question is, well, okay, does that mean that maybe ethics is like math, right? Because in math, you don't have direct observation of a number, as it were, right? There's no causal relationship between numbers. Numbers are not perceived. They're rather intellectual eidetic objects, right? They're things that exist in the mind, and they have a certain sort of cognitive content, but they don't have perceptual content, right? Think of pi, 3.14, right? Or dot, 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 pi, right? And everyone knows what pi is, right? That's the number of times that the radius can go around a circle, and it's always going to be 3.14 dot, 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 dot. It goes on forever. Now, when one looks at a circle, they don't see pi, right? So you can't observe pi like that, right? You can deduce pi, right? And also pi, numbers don't, like when you say 2 plus 2 equals 4, it's not like 2 and 2 or like this 2 causes this 2 to make 4, right? It's not of that. So observational evidence in the case of math is not direct. Now, sometimes there is observational evidence. Think about a geometer who's drawing out lines and doing a geometric proof, right? There, in that case, what you could say is that math doesn't conform to a direct perception of a geometric principle, but rather that it can be observed indirectly when one draws out the form of the relationship geometrically. So math doesn't have direct observation. You might say there's indirect observational evidence, though, and this is what the calculating and all that stuff, and maybe that's what it's doing. But guess what? That doesn't seem to be the case with regard to morality either, right? In other words, it doesn't look like a moral principle can even have an indirect observational evidence put to it, right? Imagine, for instance, take the moral principle we looked at, the idea that the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people is what one should pursue in terms of their moral actions being right. The greatest happiness principle. Well, what sort of observational evidence could support that? And the answer is there's no direct moral observation, because when you recognize things as not maximizing happiness, that is actually just a reaction of your estimation of things. And it also shows that there's no indirect observation of the principle either, or indirect evidence that could support or deny the moral principle. What it looks like, really, is that cultural relativism is still a challenge, because it raises the question of, can our moral principles themselves have a foundation that is related to the world in which we're actually living and observing things? This creates a challenge. So despite, I think, the problems with cultural relativism, it remains a significant challenge for moral philosophy. So I want to end here with what I call my little ethics challenge for cultural relativism. And these are two things I think you should do to sort of take what we've talked about in today's lesson and apply them into your life to some degree. One is practice trying to recognize the form of any argument that you hear that begins by stating a disagreement. So when you hear someone making an argument about something, and their reason is that there's disagreement about it, and therefore they conclude by denying that there is no real answer possible, Practice trying to recognize that argument form, because we've seen today with James Rachel's that that argument's invalid and should be rejected. And what you'll find is that people make these arguments all the time, and that we're surrounded by these arguments. So begin the practice of recognizing that, because when you hear those arguments and you're able to recognize that basic structure, you'll be able to know instantly that it's a bad argument. And the second sort of thing I would recommend you do is you find someone who disagrees with you about a particular moral practice and talk with them and see if you can discover whether or not the disagreement ultimately concerns a common moral principle. That is, does the disagreement have a common moral principle? That is, can you recognize that even though we disagree about how we do things, we actually agree to the same principle? Can you, as it were, deconstruct a cultural relative disagreement into a common moral value, which that may or may not be the case. That's something that you'll have to see. Once again, thank you for watching Ethics. I'm Mark Thorsby, and we'll be coming up with another video next time, and we encourage to see you then. Okay, thanks a lot, and we'll see you guys online. Bye.